Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode. Today we have Professor Sam Gilbert joining us. Um, Sam is a professor of cognitive neuroscience at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience at UCL. His research focuses mainly on the neuroscience of goals and intentions, as well as metacognition and cognitive offloading. Welcome to the show, Sam.
Thanks, it's a pleasure.
Right. So I guess the first question I have is, what exactly is cognitive offloading?
Okay. So cognitive offloading refers to any situation where you use your body or an object or the external environment to replace a process that would otherwise have been done with your brain. So, for example, if you use a post-it note or you write something down instead of remembering it yourself, or you navigate a route using a GPS device rather than your own navigation ability, and many, many other examples like that. So it's a very broad term
Hmm.
that denotes a lot of different activities which are very familiar to us on an everyday level.
Right. So the medium doesn't necessarily have to be anything as long as it's external to the brain. Is that right?
That's right. And I think one of the interesting questions in this literature is to what extent different types of cognitive offloading are equivalent or
Right.
are they different sorts of processes?
Because I assume some are maybe a bit more powerful, more potent, and more relevant even in our society.
Yeah.
Is that right?
I
Hmm.
think, I mean, definitely, some forms of cognitive offloading are really helpful, and it's hard to imagine how we could live without them.
Hmm.
Others, maybe not so much. The question
Yeah.
you raise about the novelty is one that comes up a lot, and people tend to think that cognitive offloading is a very new phenomenon, or is particularly relevant now with digital devices, changes in technology, and so on. And I'm a little skeptical of that point of view. I think that cognitive offloading is part of what makes us human, part of what we do and has been for a very long time. So whilst we certainly do have new technologies and new devices that we use these days, the principle that we will use whatever resources are available to us to accomplish cognitive tasks, not a new one at all. And so other forms of cognitive loading, pen, paper, stone tablets,
Hmm.
other forms of action and so on, these are a very old ways of
Yeah.
offloading
I did want to
information.
ask because when people hear about, using external tools, I guess the first thing we think about is technology. We think about our phones, our tablets, calculators even. Yeah, but what are some other examples of cognitive offloading before technology?
Well, depends how you define technology, of course. So
Right. That's true. Yeah. The
technology doesn't
digital
need
age,
to
maybe.
mean digital devices.
Yeah.
Pen and paper, pencils, that's technology.
Hmm.
So other forms of cognitive offloading that they can rely on older technologies such as, as I've said, pen, paper,
Hmm.
stone tablets, and other forms of, more um, less familiar forms of
Hmm.
technology today, like abacus for calculation and so on.
Would
But
you
also,
consider, sorry to interrupt, would you consider fingers a
yeah,
form of offloading? Like
uh,
counting with
I
fingers?
I think I would. So gesture is a good example. We use gesture as a way of offloading certain
Right.
cognitive demands, and also other forms of action are very useful for simplifying thought. A really
Hmm.
good example of that is, let's say you're trying to read some text which is misaligned or it's at an angle. One way you could read that text is by mentally rotating it. But what people commonly do is you can twist your head so that you can
Hmm.
normalize the text so that you can read it in a straight line again with your eyes turned that. This form of head tilt is a way of aligning objects to the orientation that you want them to be in is very commonplace, and that would count as cognitive offloading
Oh,
in
I
the
see.
way that I'm describing it here, because what you're doing is you're taking a mental process of mental rotation, which would sometimes be done just using your brain, but instead of that, you're using your musculature and your actions as a way to avoid having to do that mental processing. So that would
Hmm.
be a good example of cognitive offloading as well.
I see. Okay. Yeah, because well, we've gone to the offloading part, but my next question is about the cognition part, let's say. So when I think of cognitive offloading, I think of calendars, reminders, right? And that's to help with memory. Um, are there other forms of cognition that are dominant in this field, or is it mainly just the memory part?
Not just memory. I personally have worked mostly on memory myself. And within that, there's different types of memory that you can offload. So is your memory for future intentions or goals, or your memory for past events. They can both involve
Hmm.
cognitive offload. Other forms of cognition that we offload typically are, as I've said earlier, navigation. That's a good one. Perception as well. We do things like, if you're trying to read some text which is hard to read, you might go and switch on a light, so get a light yourself. That is, again, you're using action to simplify a form of mental demand. And so it's very widespread, and I think as I've already said, one of the key questions for us to think about that's not really resolved yet is to what extent they're cognitively similar. And I think a crucial thing to think about here is that the forms of cognition you offload might all be very different to each other. So
Hmm.
vision, perception, navigation, memory, and so on. But maybe the cognitive processes we use to regulate our offloading of that, those cognitive offloading processes might actually be common between many different forms of cognitive demand. So that's something we're trying to find out at the moment. We don't yet really have a good answer to.
I see. Do you have a hypothesis for what it might be?
My hypothesis, I mean, it's a very vague one, which is
Hmm.
that they are somewhat related but not identical.
Okay.
So if you take, for instance, a different forms of memory task, for instance, your memory for future intentions or your memory for past events, uh, people will tend to offload similarly between those two things, but within one of those two domains, their behavior will tend to be more consistent than if you compare their behavior across different domains. So there are some commonalities and some differences, I think.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. So, I guess the other question to ask is also what factors affect, right, our um, decision to perform cognitive offloading. So I guess for the sake of this, we can talk about memory and prospective memory or retrospective memory as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So my own interest in this field came about through studying prospective memory. I worked for many years on the question of how is it that people remember their future goals and intentions. And I got interested in cognitive offloading because this the scientific research into memory for future intentions was almost entirely based on studying how people remember their intentions when they have to just remember all by themselves without any help at
Hmm.
all. We all know from everyday life, we're frequently using smartphones these days, but also calendars, to-do lists, asking other people to remind us, and so on. And yet, at the time we started doing this research, there's almost nothing known on an experimental perspective about how people decide to offload or how they use forms of reminder. So, really, when we started doing this research, there were two separate questions that we were interested in. One of them is how do you decide? Let's say you need to remember to do something tomorrow. You
Hmm.
can either just remember by yourself or you can write it down or program a reminder. This dilemma of whether to use your brain or to offload your intention into the environment. We face this over and over again on any day. So if you think of all the multitude of different things that any person would do in one day, you can't write it all down. You can't program a reminder for everything. So, after I finish speaking with you, I'll reply to some emails probably tonight. I
Hmm.
will eat, I will sleep. There are kind of various routine activities which people do, and if you programmed a reminder for every single one of those, your life would grind to a halt. So we must
Yeah.
be doing some sort of strategic decision making about what intentions we need to remind ourselves about and which ones we can just handle by ourselves. So started doing this research with the main question in mind of how do people decide between these two ways of remembering intentions?
Hmm.
And we've found evidence for some factors that influence this, but I have to say it's still a bit mysterious why certain people offload intentions and others don't, or
Hmm.
why do you offload some intentions and not others? So the factors that we have found so far are, first of all, just how good you are, how good your memory is, does play a role, at least in some people or some of the time.
Yeah.
So, generally speaking, people who have a worse memory tend to set more reminders than people who have a better memory. However, that is not perfect, and
Hmm.
that is not a very reliable predictor, but it certainly does seem to predict some of the time. More importantly, though, more importantly than whether or not you actually have a good memory is whether you think you have a good memory. So the most reliable predictor we found so far of who sets reminders and who does not is whether or not you think you've got a good memory. So people who think they've got a bad memory set a lot of reminders. People who think they've got a good memory tend not to set reminders.
Hmm.
And the interesting thing here is that this is true regardless of how good your memory actually is. So
Right.
people who think they've got a bad memory are the ones who set a lot of reminders, even when perhaps they don't need them. And more worryingly, certain people who think they've got a good memory don't set reminders, even though they should be, and they forget a lot of
Hmm.
things as a result.
Hmm.
So this factor, we would call it metacognition, our ability to think about and evaluate our own abilities and mental processes, that turns out to be one of the key factors that predicts cognitive offloading.
Hmm. That's interesting. It's like being overconfident
Right.
um, about knowing something and then forgetting, why didn't I write this down?
Yeah. Well,
So, yeah. So you said that it is irrespective of how good your actual memory is, right? So, how does it compare in terms of strength of as a predictor, though?
what we generally find is that there is some element of how good people's memory actually is, and an additional element of how good they think their memory is that predicts who's going to set reminders.
Hmm.
And we generally find the people's belief about memory to be a stronger predictor. So in some of our experiments, people with a poorer memory do set more reminders, but not always. But
Hmm.
almost every time we've looked at this, we've found that people who believe they've got a poorer memory do set more reminders. So I can offer that piece of evidence.
Hmm.
Beyond that, it's quite hard to compare people's belief about their memory with their objective memory ability in terms of the strength of the prediction, because it's not really measured on the same scale.
Right.
But we certainly find more reliably people's beliefs about their memory rather than their actual memory ability seems to be the key factor.
I see. I see. Well, the next thing I would say is about task, because for me, I guess different tasks would have different, let's say, likelihood of forgetting, right? If it's not as important to me or not as salient, or maybe even further in the future, does this vary across the individual as well?
It's a good question about whether it varies across the individual. I don't know whether we have any evidence about that. We certainly do have evidence, though, that the value that we attach to intentions is an important factor, both in whether we remember them or not, and also in whether we set reminders. So we
Hmm.
found in our own work that people tend to set more reminders for the intentions which they think are more important or more valuable to them. So that is definitely a factor. And as I've said, people's memory for valuable intentions tends to be better than less valuable. And in fact, you can look at this in the literature on people who've been investigating how do we remember the things we intend to do. Actually, Freud was one person who wrote about this a little bit, and you can find Freud writing that, understandably, if someone that you have a romantic attachment to forgets to do the things you've asked them to do, that's an indicator that they don't perhaps care about
Hmm.
you as much as you want them to.
Yeah.
So you can see in this kind of approach that the value that we attach to intentions is a really important factor. One other
Mm,
thing I'd add to that is that anecdotally, I would say that if you see someone offloading information, it's a way of them communicating to you that they find that information useful. So if you're talking to someone and they're writing it down, one of the
mm,
things they're doing is helping themselves to remember that information. But it can also act as a social cue that we use to inform the other person that we think that what they're telling us is so important, it needs to be stored somewhere. So it's both a social and a cognitive tool in a way.
mm. That's interesting. Well, I asked the question initially because I had a conversation with Steve Fleming before, and he was telling me about this thing called metacognitive bias. And that's kind of where your metacognitive sensitivity isn't very good. So you're more inclined to, um, say, have lower confidence regardless of the performance
Mm,
of your cognitive task. And
mm,
then if you're biased strongly in the other direction, then you'll be more overconfident.
mm.
Yeah, so I, it made me think about how metacognitive bias could be something that is irrespective of task, and as a result, cause people to, I don't know, be more reliant or less reliant on it. Yeah.
Mm.
And
Good
then
point.
there's also this really complicated thing about because you can kind of be metacognitive about your metacognition, like knowing um that you have a tendency to be overconfident. Um yeah, and I don't know,
Yeah.
just yeah, some thoughts on that.
So I think there's a few things to unpick there, and I
Yep.
agree, metacognition is absolutely key. I think if you look in the field of metacognition research, people describe various aspects, and two that you've mentioned there are sensitivity and bias.
Yes.
Generally speaking, sensitivity refers to the way that we're able to monitor the fluctuations in our performance. So, for example, being able to detect those times you're not doing a task so well compared with those times you're doing a task better. So, monitoring those fluctuations in performance is very important in certain contexts. And I think often um, the researchers who focus on metacognitive sensitivity are often those ones who are particularly interested in perception and consciousness. For instance, are we conscious of a stimulus? Is the stimulus really there or is it not there? To do that kind of monitoring, you need to monitor the fluctuations in your cognitive performance over time. So that's sensitivity. The other aspect of metacognition, and one that I'm particularly interested in, is metacognitive bias.
Hmm.
And that refers not so much to monitoring fluctuations in one's performance, but just a general sense of being confident that you do things well, or pessimistic, lacking in confidence and thinking that you do them badly. So that doesn't really vary from moment to moment so much. It's about just a general level of calibrating your level of confidence to your level of performance. Sorry, you can hear my dog barking in the background. So,
No, it's okay. It's not very loud.
so I think people in the memory field tend to be more interested in metacognitive bias, I think.
Hmm.
And I'm really interested in bias because it relates to this question of are you underconfident? You think you're quite bad at a task, but actually you're better, or are you overconfident? And that's relevant, of course, to cognitive offloading because an underconfident person might set reminders or get help from ChatGPT or do some other form of offloading to help them with a task, even when perhaps they don't need that help. On the other hand, an overconfident person, someone who says, "Oh, I'm going to nail this," and doesn't ever doubt their ability, they might not think that they need to use cognitive tools when they really do. And
Hmm.
that can be particularly harmful if, for instance, you have an important appointment that you need to go to, and you always think, "Oh, I'll be fine, I'll remember that," then you don't. You could see that if, in a situation like that where you don't go to an appointment because you didn't think you needed a reminder and you forget about that, you could see that as a failure of memory, that you've failed to remember the thing that you thought you would remember to do.
Yep.
But alternatively, you could see that as a failure of metacognition. You've believed that you would remember something, but then you did not remember it. And that failure of metacognition might be a more important factor than the failure of memory because we're all going to forget things. Like failures of memory, that's just a fact of life. But
Hmm.
you can take steps to mitigate those failures of memory. So what's really worrying is a person who thinks that they're always going to do everything perfectly, they don't need any help, and then they don't take the steps that could remedy that.
Hmm.
I'm particularly interested in those forms of overconfidence and what we could do to ameliorate them. Last of all, you mentioned this interesting idea about another metacognitive level. So, how much trust should we have in our level of confidence? Like, if I
Yeah.
think that I'm going to do something, should I just take that as done and then not take any steps, or should I admit the possibility of error in my judgment about myself and then still program that reminder or take some other step? That I'd say has rarely been studied experimentally, this kind of meta level of metacognition, but I think it could be a key factor.
Hmm. On that note, I actually have an episode coming up with Dr. Maxine Sherman, who
Mhm.
I think she published a paper recently on metacognition. I haven't
Yes.
really gotten down to looking at it yet, but I intend on asking her about it
Good.
later on. But I
Yeah.
think it ties very nicely into your question of what we can do to help people in that way.
Yeah.
Because and I've thought about this before, humor me for a bit, but I've always viewed uh, cognitive uh, behavioral therapy, CBT, um, as a form of external metacognition, in the sense that for people who are unable to get out of their, let's say, toxic, maladaptive thinking processes, right? It's because they're not aware that life isn't actually so bad, or their skills aren't actually that bad. And so having somebody outside of you give you kind of advice, or another perspective, is a way to, have that second perspective in a form of metacognition. I'm wondering if that could apply to um, the cognitive offloading as well,
Mhm.
or if you have any other ideas on maybe how to help people
Yeah.
that way.
I think there's two aspects there that are relevant. So first of all, of course, you could think of the interpersonal relationship between a client and a therapist, counselor, and so on, as a form of cognitive offloading, the forms of regulation which you might do on your own can also be outsourced to another person, which can be a very effective way of doing that. And then, in terms of the metacognition side of it, how can we train metacognition? How can we improve metacognition? I think this is absolutely crucial. So, if the key factor that determines whether we use tools and resources and opportunities that are available to us is our level of confidence, and if people are sometimes miscalibrated in that confidence, then finding ways to improve the calibration would be a really helpful thing to do. So some of our recent work has been to investigate exactly this issue of what can we do that would make people more accurate in the way they judge their own level of performance or level of ability, and does that have a knock-on effect that people use tools and technologies in a more adaptive way. So we've started doing these studies in the laboratory, and what we find is that we can improve people's use of cognitive tools just by giving them a very brief training session. So what
Mhm.
we do is we give people a task where they need to remember various items for a memory test. And for half of the participants, we give them feedback. So we tell people for 5 times in a row, you thought you were going to get 40% correct, but actually you got 50% correct or something like that. They just do this for a few minutes to get a bit of training and a bit of feedback about how accurate their predictions are. And then they go on to do the main part of the experiment. And what we find is that just a few minutes of training makes people more, better calibrated to their level of memory performance. And more importantly, it makes them choose to use reminders just when they need them more accurately. So we've definitely found that in a laboratory task, we can make people more accurate in using memory technology just with a very brief training intervention to let people understand how good their memory really is. What we'd like to do now is try to move that into real life and
Hmm.
see whether we can develop interventions that would make people more accurate in remembering their everyday intentions and everyday memories and using technology more adaptively there. These kinds of studies, when you move out of the laboratory into real life, get really complicated and really
Yeah.
difficult to do. So we are working on this. We're collecting some
Hmm.
data at the moment. We're doing it with a interview approach. So what we do is we get people to fill out surveys where they tell us about their real life, naturally occurring intentions. So instead of coming to the laboratory and performing some artificial test that we instruct them to do, we ask people, what are you planning? What's going on for the next few days? What would you like to remember to do? And they write
Hmm.
down these very interesting lists of their everyday activities that they are planning to enact, and then we try to find out what strategies they're going to use to help them with those. And then we are delivering interventions to see whether we can make people more effective in the choice of strategies. So that's
Hmm.
something we're working on right now.
Hmm. That sounds great. I mean, yeah, having been part of the psychology program and well, trying out lab experiments of my own, I've definitely become more aware of the kind of balance you need with internal and external or ecological validity. Because, you could have a really strong laboratory experiment, but then it's hard to generalize outside. And especially with studies on metacognition, um, or interventions for metacognition, I struggle sometimes to think about ways that we can kind of remind ourselves to be better. It's kind of almost like a self-initiative that you need to have. And so yeah, I understand the struggle
Yeah. I
with
think
coming
in
up with
this
it.
this
Yeah.
field of metacognition research, there's a disconnect in a way that there's various people who measure metacognition in different ways. So one of those ways is with these very, very beautifully constrained, elegant laboratory experiments where you can perfectly control the perceptual stimuli that people are presented with
Yeah.
and get people to give very accurate ratings, and you can fit very careful mathematical models to the way that they perform those tasks.
Yes.
Those are really important for driving theory, but can be hard to extrapolate to real life
Hmm.
metacognitive activities that we perform. But the real life metacognition is quite hard to measure in a rigorous
Yes.
and principled way.
Hmm.
So ideally, you want to find links between those two approaches, not just do them on their own.
Hmm. Okay. Very interesting. Let's move away from metacognition for a bit. And I wanted to ask about predictors for cognitive offloading, like age or maybe even gender, or
Mhm.
yeah. What do you know?
We have looked at age. We've looked both in older adults and in children compared with young adults. So there is some evidence out there. The first thing I'll say is it's really hard to do these experiments,
Yeah.
particularly if you're looking at older adults and their use of memory technology. It's hard to get the experiments right because what you need to do is you need to sample your participants. You need to find some younger people and some older people to participate in your research.
Hmm.
And the problem when you do this in this, it's a so-called cross-sectional approach where you take some currently younger people and some currently older people and you compare them. The problem is you don't really know whether they're matched in kind of background factors or not.
Hmm.
So if I do an experiment and I test 50 19, 20-year-old students who are studying at UCL and they need to do some experiments as part of their course or to earn a bit of extra money. And I also test 50, 70, 80, 90-year-olds who are retired and volunteering to take part in psychology experiments as something that they enjoy or are interested in doing. We don't know that those two groups of people are in any sense comparable, even, if you forget about their age. So it might be that they differ in how motivated they are to take part in your research. It might be that they differ in how, obviously your older participants grew up at an earlier time than than your younger participants. So maybe there's something about the education and the early life experiences that your groups of participants have had. So they're going to differ on a lot of different factors, not least that a 90-year-old who is spending their day taking part in psychology research because they think it's interesting is probably quite an exceptional 90-year-old. They're
Mm.
probably quite cognitively healthy relative to the general population,
Yeah.
and they're probably particularly interested in how their memory works and might want to test how good it is. So for all these reasons, it's very hard to um, compare younger and older adults and really know that what you're finding would generalize to the rest of the
Yeah.
population.
I can
But
imagine
that's
that
the
there are a
main
lot of
caveat.
covariates
Oh,
as well.
please say again.
I could imagine that there's a lot of covariates as well. Yeah,
Yeah,
sorry to
exactly.
interrupt. Yeah.
So you have these confounding factors. Nevertheless, what we found when we did this research did surprise us. When we began doing this research, we thought that older people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s generally would tend to hold a negative self-evaluation of their memory abilities. We all are aware of the stereotypes about aging and memory and becoming forgetful as we get older. So we thought that older people would be really low in their confidence in their memory abilities. And as a result of that, they would really like to set a lot of reminders. They would not trust their memory, and instead of using their own memory, they would write things down. They would program reminders in, or whatever they could do to avoid having to remember things themselves. Actually, what we found was the opposite, really. We found that older adults tend to use cognitive offloading at a similar rate to younger adults, even when they need more help. So what this means
Mhm.
is that actually older adults were under using technology. They were tending to rely on their memory when their memory wasn't good enough to solve a particular task. Whereas
Mhm.
the younger adults were more likely to um, just use technology as a way of avoiding their memory demands. So it's not what we expected, and
Mm.
what it suggests is that there is a risk as we get older that we might fail to use memory technology because we might be overconfident in our memory ability, and we would be better off using more memory technology than we actually do as older adults.
Mm.
So that's what we found so far in those studies. But as I said earlier, there is a caveat there, which is that these experiments are quite hard to interpret because we don't know enough about the people who volunteer to take part in them.
Mm.
The other thing we've done is look at young children, and it's quite interesting, I think, that you can find evidence of cognitive offloading as young as 4 years of age. So even
Oh.
4-year-olds will think to put a sticker on top of an upturned cup to remind them that's the cup that's got a toy underneath it or a prize or something. So young children can be really good at using techniques like cognitive offloading to help them remember, but they don't offload as adaptively as older children or young adults do. So, one of the things that we often find in this research is that people tend to be selective in cognitive offloading. If I just give you one thing to remember, you might just remember that by yourself. But if I give you a list of many things to remember, you'd write them down because it's too much.
Mhm.
And what we tend to find is that younger children are not so selective. They will either always write everything down or never. And they're not so nuanced then in the way
Right.
that they adapt their use of memory strategies to the task that they're doing. We still don't have a huge amount, and one uh, part of the lifespan that we don't have any evidence about yet is adolescence, which I think could be a really interesting time. So we've got studies from about 4 years of age to about 13 years of age. And then we've got studies from 18 years upwards, all the way up to about 95, I think. But as far as I'm aware, I can't think right now of any studies that have looked at cognitive offloading in adolescence, which is a really important time of life because people are establishing independence, they are developing metacognitively a great deal and getting to understand their own cognitive abilities. So understanding the development that happens at that point in the lifespan could be really interesting, I think.
Yeah, and the number of things you'd have to remember would also increase
Yes,
much more year
exactly.
on year
Quite.
in yeah.
So that's absolutely right that you might think that the ability to use offloading adaptively would lag behind the demands that are placed on you. So you need to experience your memory system and its failures before you can then
Mm,
start making steps to mitigate those failures. I often, the way I sometimes think about this is that when you look at the evidence about memory ability and age, that is our organic memory ability when we just use our brain to remember to do something or to remember a past experience, the peak of our memory abilities is around about 18, 20 years, that kind of age. And it's
that's too
sort of
early.
downhill from that point onwards. In some forms of memory task, the decline is earlier than others, and things like, semantic memory, memory for the meaning of words seems to be very preserved right through the lifespan. But something like working memory, where you need to remember a chunk of information over a brief time period before using that information, that
Mm,
ability declines from about, 20 years onwards. So the 18 to 20-year olds that I teach, for example, as students, they are at the peak of their organic memory abilities, and yet are not necessarily the most organized people or reliable when you come to kind of thinking about remembering to do things or um, other real world memory tasks. And one possible reason for that is that when you're relatively young and you haven't had so many experiences of your memory failures, you're less likely to take steps to avoid them. The other possibility is that you need to pass a threshold in the demands that are placed on your memory before you then realize there's no hope that you'll be able to do this all by yourself. So you need to use tools to help you. So there can actually be cognitive advantages to being kind of cognitively stressed, to having a lot of demands placed on you, because those demands can exceed a threshold that require you to then enact strategies. Whereas when you're below that threshold, you might just rely on your own abilities to try and muddle by. So there are a lot of reasons why, even when we're at the peak of our organic cognitive abilities, we might actually not perform as well as when we're a bit more cognitively frazzled, but we understand the frailties of our cognitive machinery a bit better.
mhm. I would think that it's the adolescent years where you kind of fine-tune your sensitivity to, I guess, and understand your cognitive abilities.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you were talking about the children, the first thing that came to my mind was perhaps it's some form of um, early primitive heuristic, maybe that they're going off of, and then over time the heuristic kind of gets um, overridden by metacognition. It's
Yeah.
purely speculative, but yeah.
Well, we have found, I mean, so in at least one of the studies that we've done, we find that younger children tend to be quite rigid in the strategies that they use. So they'll pick a strategy and just stick with it rather
Mm,
than adapting the strategy to the situation. You could think of that as a heuristic in a way. It's true, incidentally, of all of us to some extent. So it would be cognitively very wasteful every time you're presented with a situation to really spend a long time working out the best strategy.
mhm,
Sometimes you're better off just picking a good enough strategy and sticking with that as a general principle than having to think every time about the best way to accomplish a task. So there is some advantage in that potentially. The
mm,
other thing that we sometimes find, especially in very young children, is that they can be hopelessly overconfident. They just don't understand their memory limitations. And so that can also lead to a failure to adapt the strategy to the different type of task demand that you face.
mm. I want to link this to what you said earlier about the more elderly population. Because, and again, this is probably more speculative than anything, but um, do you think that the elderly have um, use cognitive offloading less often because of an issue with metacognitive sensitivity, or because they're generally more biased to be confident? Uh, yeah.
There's a conflict in the literature here. So some research suggests that older adults tend to be pessimistic, underconfident in their memory abilities, especially if they're reminded of age or that age becomes salient to them as part of the task or the experiment. So certainly some literature suggests that older adults would be underconfident. However, other research, actually including our own studies, has pointed to the opposite finding, which is that older adults sometimes can be overconfident in their memory abilities. I think it's not fully resolved why there are these contradictions in the evidence. One
Mm,
possible reason for overconfidence is that we build up our calibration or our evaluation of our cognitive abilities over a lifetime of experience. And those beliefs about our abilities can be quite hard to shift.
yes.
So when
Yeah.
you're experiencing cognitive decline, your level of ability might be at one point, but your memory of how good you are could relate to a whole lifetime of experience when you were generally better than you currently are now. So that might be one possible explanation for overconfidence. But it's very hard to really unpick these different factors. What would be useful, and we don't have much evidence along these lines, would be to do longitudinal studies where you study people over a very long period of time as
Mm,
their memory performance changes or declines, and then see how their confidence in their memory abilities tracks that or fails to track it.
mm,
Incidentally, the other interesting thing that often comes up in discussions about aging and technology is whether we are predisposing ourselves to cognitive decline by using technology too much.
yes. That
For
was my
some
next
people,
question, actually.
certainly,
Yeah.
you have this use it or lose it idea, which is absolutely true, that we need to remain cognitively active in order to preserve our cognitive abilities. But I would say that this does not mean that you should avoid using technology. I would say it means that you just need to make sure you remain cognitively active in other ways as well. And in fact, there are now some longitudinal studies that measure people's use of technology when they're in their 40s and 50s and follows those people up into their 70s and 80s. And so you can actually get some longitudinal data here. You might think that people who use a lot of technology in their middle age would go on to develop cognitive decline at a faster rate. That's certainly an idea that's been put out there. There is this phrase that people sometimes use of digital dementia, claiming that by overusing cognitive technology, we are predisposing ourselves to cognitive decline. Actually, the evidence points to exactly the opposite. So if you do longitudinal studies, the finding tends to be that people who are most using digital technology in their midlife go on to develop cognitive decline at a slower rate. They preserve their cognitive abilities for longer than those who don't use digital technology so much. This is in relation to things like using the internet and computer use. Television is bad. People who watch a lot of television tend to go on to develop cognitive decline at a faster rate. These studies are hard to unpick. Of course, there could be various factors that predict both one's use of technology and one's rate of cognitive decline. Socioeconomic status, what one does for one's profession, what opportunities are afforded to one in life. So it's quite hard to unpick the different factors here, though the studies have tried to do this. And so, insofar as it's possible to deconfound socioeconomic factors from others, these studies have tried to do this. Um, Nevertheless, if it were the case, as some people claim, that using cognitive technology is catastrophic for our cognitive abilities, then you'd predict that people who do a lot of uh, internet browsing and other things would develop cognitive decline at a faster rate. And that really is not the case. There's many studies now showing the opposite. So I tend to think that the fears around technology use and cognition are strongly overplayed and that the popular discourse about this is really unbalanced. And it worries me, especially in a situation where, for instance, anecdotally, you hear stories about older people who refrain from using technology to help them with remembering medication or other types of health-related behaviors because they feel that it would keep them cognitively healthy to remember to do things for themselves. Actually, I think it's a really good idea to use cognitive technology where it's useful, as long as that doesn't displace our, using your brain to do other things, which I think it probably doesn't in a lot of cases.
Hmm, I see. Well, there's a few things I was thinking about there. One is, of course, yeah, I totally see how people, well, there's this kind of stigma and over reliance of technology, right? Especially now with AI, with ChatGPT. A lot of people are saying things like, oh, don't rely on ChatGPT to do your work. You're just gonna become over reliant and not be able to think for yourself. We're gonna lose our creativity or critical thinking or whatnot, right? Um, but as I was thinking about this and over what you were saying just now, it seems to me like there needs to be a distinction between which aspects of cognition we're referring to. Because like I asked at the start, right, there is memory, but then there is also, reason, right? There is also perception as well. And I believe that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like some some forms of cognitive offloading uh, are, how would you put it, not as detrimental as others. Um, yeah, because I can imagine a world where, because memory is going to decline anyway, it would be for the best if you used these reminders or calendars or whatnot. But I can also see a case where um, an over-reliance on AI, for example, to perform your critical thinking and evaluation could kind of limit the development of your, let's say, fluid intelligence.
Mhm.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a really important point that we use different technologies to offload different cognitive demands. And it's something that's not discussed very much in this literature or in this discourse, that when we talk about technology, it refers to such a huge multitude of different things, or even
Yeah,
a single device like a smartphone. You use that device for so many different purposes. It's too simplistic just to say whether smartphone usage is good or bad,
yeah,
because it will be many, many different things. The point you make about different forms of thinking is really important, that we offload both mundane rote memory, things like your shopping list or people's telephone numbers that you have now in your contacts book, rather than trying to memorize them. That is, I think, a use of technology which is really good, that your phone will be much better than you will be at remembering that kind of rote information, and that by relying on your device to remember those things for you, you then enable yourself to use your brain to do other things, which
yes,
is great.
yes,
So that kind of task where our brain-based cognitive abilities are pretty poor, but technology can be really good. That's the sort of thing you should definitely be using technology for. On the other hand, things like forms of creative thinking and other um, cognitive abilities, which we can't replace so easily with technology, that's where people would be worrying more, quite rightly, worrying about the use of technology offsetting our own learning experiences or removing those learning experiences and potentially, you know, leading to a drop in ability. This is something that's been studied, for instance, in the context of navigation. So if you get people to navigate a route or learn a route, and some people have to learn it by themselves, and other people learn it using a GPS device. If you remove that GPS device, the people who learn using it suddenly, they get lost.
mm,
So it can be detrimental to our learning of a particular route, for instance, or another other forms of information if we rely on technology when we are encountering it to begin with. However, I think there's a really important point to make about these sorts of studies, which is that it might be true that if I've learned a particular route using Google Maps and then my phone battery dies and I have to try and figure it out by myself, I might fail to navigate that route. So I've lost the ability to navigate that particular route. But that does not mean that I've lost the ability to navigate in general. We're just talking about losing
Hmm.
particular content or particular information. So it's a very widespread finding in this literature that when we entrust information or memory to an external device and that device is unexpectedly removed, then we will tend to fail to remember that information because we've offloaded it and forgotten all about it. But that does not show that we've lost the ability to remember. It shows that we have lost the content of that particular memory or information. And actually, you might say that is exactly as it should be, because if you have a reliable or generally reliable external device and you can entrust certain information to that device, then it makes sense to declutter your brain by removing that information and instead reprioritizing your ability to encode or think about other things.
Hmm.
So I am somewhat skeptical of the claims which are made that by overuse of technology, we are losing cognitive abilities. Because if you look at the evidence for those claims, they're mostly based on people losing particular information, not abilities, which are harder to measure in general.
Hmm. Yes, well, I think it's a really important thing to discover and to research on because it can be quite detrimental to our, the stigma surrounding technology and
Yeah,
when people choose to use it.
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Okay, so I want to leave a bit of time for prefrontal cortex, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's just one question really. But to preface that, I need to ask, what is the role of the prefrontal cortex first?
I would say probably more than one role, or it's quite
Hmm.
hard to describe a very large area of the brain just in terms of one function. But generally speaking, people think about the prefrontal cortex as being involved in controlling, organizing, regulating behavior and emotion and cognition in general. So the prefrontal cortex is sometimes associated with so-called executive functions or cognitive control. So that relates to our ability to resist temptation, to plan for the future, these sorts of high-level behaviors that we use to be goal-directed and focused on a particular task rather than just responding in a very reflex-like way to any particular
Hmm.
experience.
Okay, and my main question is about why it is so hard to study the prefrontal cortex. Yeah, because
Yeah,
when I read some of the literature and I speak to people in this field, it does seem like it's such a difficult thing
yeah,
to get our hands on,
yeah,
to try and test and
yeah.
manipulate variables for. So why exactly is that so difficult?
I'm sure there are many reasons. Here are some of them. One reason why it's hard to study the prefrontal cortex, or several reasons, are methodological. So the prefrontal cortex seems to be a particularly large area in the human brain compared with non-human species, and it's involved in abilities which seem to be particularly well developed in humans compared with other species. So this means that animal research, which is plays a role in our understanding of other parts of the brain and other cognitive abilities, is less prevalent in study of prefrontal cortex function. I mean, it is prevalent and it certainly does exist, but it doesn't play the same role because animals don't always have the same abilities that humans have, and anatomically, the the structure of the prefrontal cortex may not be so well anatomically preserved across different species as other regions of the brain. The structure is preserved. So that's one of the methodological reasons. Another methodological reason, if you're thinking about human neuroscience, methods is that generally speaking, it's rare that people have damage to very small and well circumscribed regions of the prefrontal cortex.
Mm.
For example, if people who have tumors, slow growing tumors in the brain, by the time they are diagnosed and would be tested, these tumors have generally got quite large. And one of the reasons for that is that the functions of the prefrontal cortex are quite subtle in terms of the way they manifest in behavior. So if you think about if you have damage in your visual cortex, you'll become aware of visual
Yeah.
disturbance very rapidly. If you have damage in your motor cortex and you are have difficulty with movement, that is very apparent very quickly. But if you have a subtle change in your personality or your ability to stay on track with particular goals, you might just think, I'm not sleeping enough at the moment, or I'm distracted, or I'm getting
Yes.
older. So it's not so apparent in behavior. The other thing is that it's quite hard to develop tasks or measures which are sensitive to human prefrontal cortex function. Again, if you want to measure someone's visual ability, you can devise tests of that more straightforwardly than how you devise a test that measures someone's ability to regulate and control and organize their behavior.
Mm.
So I think it's, methodologically very complex as well. I would also say that there is a conceptual issue, which is, what language should we use for thinking about the functions of prefrontal cortex? People tend to use various terms like inhibition, working memory, or short-term memory,
Mm.
multitasking, uh, goal setting, emotion regulation. These are particular phrases that people use, but there is no necessary reason why those taxonomies are necessarily the correct ones for thinking about the prefrontal cortex. And it might be the case that in the same way as the brain functions that you see in these old phrenology brains, that's like hopefulness and
Hmm.
benevolence and faith and things like this, we now think that those concepts don't really describe the way that the human brain is organized. We might have a similar problem with the way that we think about the prefrontal cortex in terms of what's the fundamental taxonomy or organizing principle. And so I think we're still a very long way from having any form of well accepted framework for how do we organize and think about the functions
Mm.
of the prefrontal cortex. And at the moment, we've got a lot of different people who do different things, people who work on different subregions, people who work with different methods, people who work with different species, and different tasks or abilities. And at the moment, it's a real multiplicity of voices, which is great scientifically, but I don't think we've reached an integration yet in terms of really how we understand how the prefrontal cortex works.
Mm. Okay, I think that's a very satisfying answer.
Okay.
Um, just to conclude, one final question for me is, what can we look forward to from you in the future?
Don't know about look forward, but well, as I was saying earlier, one of the things that I'm increasingly interested in is how do we translate these quite theoretical or abstract approaches that we take in the laboratory to real world practical uses. So I'm very interested at the moment about like interventions, how we can develop interventions that change people's use of cognitive offloading and whether they really make a difference in the real world. The other thing is I'm interested in different aspects of cognitive offloading that are emerging now. And one example that we hear about a lot is generative AI. So, for instance, are people who use ChatGPT to help them with their writing assignments the same as the people who use reminders with their memory? And also, are the principles that govern use of memory offloading similar to ChatGPT? I'm losing my voice, so I'm going to have to stop there, I'm afraid.
That is amazing. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And it was a pleasure speaking to you.
You too. Thank you very much. Take care.
Professor Sam, everyone.